Welcome to Season 3 of Students of Mind, the podcast that's all about opening up and normalizing discussions about mental health in ways that anyone can comprehend. In the first 2 seasons, we sat down with mental health experts and survivors to give you a full circle picture of each topic. In this new season, we will continue to explore the world of mental health through the insights of experts, healers, and individuals with lived experience. From alternative healing modalities to living with multiple illnesses, this season we will cover a wide range of topics with the help of a diverse selection of guests. My name is Jade, and today is the first of a 2-part series looking at autism and mental health and how they interact with and affect each other. For this first episode, I'm joined with licensed psychologist Dr. Jessica Mizak. I hope by listening to the show, you're able to learn something new and gain some encouragement through hearing our experts and listening to the journeys of our guests. However, this show is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your mental health professional or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have about your condition. Never disregard professional advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on the Students of Mind podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Jessica Mizak. Dr. Myszak is a licensed psychologist who has been practicing since 2010. Her primary training has included children, adolescents, and families with a focus on developmental disabilities. Recently, Dr. Myszak began posting on TikTok to spread awareness and education about autism and mental health. Well, good morning or good afternoon, Dr. Myszak. Thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Of course, I'm so excited for our conversation. I think it'll be really interesting. But before we get into it, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. I'm Jessica Mizak. I am a psychologist in the Chicago area, and I have a private practice called the Help and Healing Center. And my goal is to provide neurodiversity affirming psychological evaluations for children and adults, which has also led to providing some other resources that are helpful for autistic individuals. So a lot of the work that I do is more of the subtle presentations of autism. So PDA and high masking autism in adults. And so that's been very interesting. So I started my practice in 2020, and since then I've also sort of moved into developing an e-course that's about neurodiversity and providing some information on TikTok about autism and neurodiversity, and also starting up an online community for autistic adults. So, I think sort of doing this work, I sort of see where there's some areas where there's some room for improvement and some need for resources, and so trying to fill some of those gaps.
That's amazing. I love that you are sharing your knowledge on TikTok. What inspired you to use that as a mode of sharing what you know?
Well, I was scared of it for the longest time, and so it took me a while before I, actually decided that was something I wanted to do. But just doing the work that I do, I started coming across more and more creators who were talking about their own experiences and sharing tips and sharing tricks and things that they had learned and their wisdom. And I was kind of amazed at the algorithm and how good it was at noticing that I was the person who might be interested in that kind of content, and kept seeing that. And, there was a lot of people talking about their own experiences, but there wasn't a lot of professionals who were providing a lot of good information about that. And so, again, it seemed like, a gap that I could fill. And so, I sort of got brave and tried it. And my first videos were pretty terrible, but, I stuck with it and have had a really good positive response. And so I'm glad. I think it's been a really good thing.
That's so cool. So yes, let's get into the topic of today. I'm excited to talk to you about autism spectrum disorder and how it relates to mental health. So just to start, can you talk about what autism spectrum disorder is and how common it is?
Absolutely. So autism, it's a developmental condition, and it impacts sort of all aspects of a person. It impacts how a person perceives information. It impacts how a person socializes with other people. And it can cause problems with social interaction and communication with people who are not autistic. So it really is just, on a basic level, a brain difference that impacts all areas of a person's life. So many autistic people do have sensory sensitivities. They may have a strong need for routine, engage in some repetitive patterns of behavior, and also have some areas of special interests. This can absolutely present very differently in different people, and because of that, it can have very different sort of impacts on a person's life. In terms of how common this is, the best estimate we have, the most recent estimate, is that probably 1 out of 44 children is autistic. But those numbers keep changing. 20 years ago, we thought it was, I think, 1 in 150. And so, that's really a dramatic change. And I think a result of us sort of better understanding how this looks in different people.
Yeah, that's very interesting how that has shifted. Can you talk a little bit about some of the more common misconceptions that there are out there about autism?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the biggest misconceptions is just that somebody that's autistic is going to look like Rain Man or Sheldon or the Good Doctor, or some of those really, big stereotypes that are in the media. These particular stereotypes are actually pretty unusual in the spectrum of autism. But I think that because of how popular those have been, there's a lot of people out in the public that, when someone says they're autistic, that's immediately what they think of. I think another misconception is that autism is way more common in boys than it is in girls, or males than females. It is identified more in boys. But it is likely that probably the rates are about the same. And I think, because of that, there's many, many undiagnosed females who are autistic. And many of these may have been misdiagnosed with other conditions, or, are high masking and sort of go unnoticed because what other people see is, it doesn't look like autism, in the eyes of somebody who doesn't, isn't familiar with masking. And I think a third misconception is probably just that if somebody was autistic, you would know it. And again, that's true, that some people have very, very obvious traits that are very recognizable. But a lot of people don't. And I think, when you look at adolescents, when you look at adults who are high masking, again, masking is this idea of, okay, well, I can learn some of these invisible rules and I can do these things and sort of act this way that I know that people are expecting me to act, and ways that are going to make you more comfortable. It's sort of putting in all this additional work and sort of doing things that are not intuitive, but sort of learning these invisible rules and following these invisible rules. So somebody who's doing this, especially as they get older, they have a lot of experience and they have a lot of practice doing this. And so sometimes that can be really hard to identify, and an average person and even a very educated person may not notice this unless they sort of ask the question, why do you make eye contact? And what is that like for you? Is that something that's just intuitive and it feels right as you're connecting with a person? Or did you learn that you're probably being dishonest if you're not making eye contact? And so, you better do that or people aren't going to believe you. So I think people who are masking, I mean, they're often doing so out of a place of fear or a place of discomfort and feel like they have to blend in, or people are going to think they're crazy or think that they're weird, or, not think that they're capable of doing things that they are. And so, I think masking is a really critical component that is sometimes missed or, not given enough attention to.
Yeah, I was going to ask about masking because that's something that I've seen a lot of content on TikTok made about, and specifically like that being like a way that like mental health implications show up for people. So I'm excited to get into that. But before we do, can you talk a little bit about like the diagnosis process? How common is it for people to generally get a diagnosis, and like how long is that process?
Yeah, so I think it really dramatically differs, sort of where you're looking at and sort of what age a person is. So many people are diagnosed as young children. So especially boys, especially, kids that might have some other kind of complicating issues too. So maybe intellectual disabilities or speech delays, where they're already kind of on somebody's radar and going in for psychological testing and things in the first place. So, younger kids, I mean, sometimes they're diagnosed as early as 2 or 3 or around that age. But I think for people who don't have intellectual disabilities, people who are able to, kind of parse out some of those invisible rules like we were talking about, it can take a lot longer. And I think sometimes these kids are noted as, being quirky or being kind of unusual or, being sort of a little professor, like they have, preferring to hang out with teachers as opposed to other kids. And so sometimes, some of these people are now 20 or 30 or 40 or older and still sort of feeling different, still feeling like there's something about me that's different. And so that's a lot of the work that I'm doing right now. It's adults who, they don't need school accommodations anymore. They just for themselves have always felt different, have always felt like certain things are harder than they seem to be for other people. And so they're sort of looking for that answer, that reason why they do feel different.
So let's say after someone gets a diagnosis, what are the steps that are generally taken next for that person? Are there like, do you start talking about accommodations, or like what happens next?
Yeah. So again, sort of depends on the age of the person and sort of what's going on in their life. And so, for a child, lots of times parents will enroll their child in different types of therapy. So yeah, if that's speech therapy or a therapy for social skills or other kind of things, or getting accommodations at school, getting an IEP. Those are usually important things, just to sort of help the child at that point. As an adult, it's a little bit more complicated. So I think it can be really, really validating for a person to finally have an answer, to finally kind of understand why that's the case. But I do think it can be kind of emotional too, because I know a lot of the people that I work with, have some grief there. They have this like, man, what if I would have known this when I was a kid? What if I would have known this as I was going through school? How much kinder would I have been to myself? How much, different could things have been? And oftentimes people have to unlearn some of the things that they were doing to cope. So many people have learned to not trust their body. Many people have learned to just tolerate stuff that is really uncomfortable. And part of, I think, understanding an autism diagnosis is just being kinder to yourself and giving yourself the accommodations. Recognizing that, okay, you can't book, appointment, that you need to, kind of space things out. Or I think being aware of your environment and, okay, maybe you need headphones, maybe you need a special tint on your glasses, that can make a really dramatic difference. So some of that is formal. I mean, so sometimes, if a person is at a place of work where they have accommodations available, and again, legally they should, or if they're in school where they, are in graduate school or in college and they need some extra support, then absolutely sort of taking that diagnosis to, student services or HR or whatever, to request those things is really important. But a lot of it is also being able to do those things for themselves, So many people, that I work with, they're not in school. They are either self-employed or unemployed. And so they don't need those things, but they need, sort of that validation that, okay, it's okay that I'm doing this. It's okay that this is different. And I do often recommend that people start therapy if they're not already in there. I always say, this is a good time for therapy, if you're willing to do that, because I think it's a major shift in understanding, and I think it can be a turning point in some areas. And so I think having someone that is educated, somebody who can be supportive, someone to kind of walk alongside you, I think is really helpful to have.
Yeah, I love the piece of just like the diagnosis is kind of helping explain some of the things that may have been experienced through the years and kind of just validating their experiences. I think that's great, and I think that's very similar to like mental health diagnoses. Like when you get a diagnosis and you're finally like, oh, this is the thing that's been going on, it can be so affirming. And in my research for this episode, I found a lot of articles that said like autism is not a mental illness, and just being very adamant about that. But I did feel like I noticed that there is a connection between autism and mental health. So can you talk about like how autism and mental health are connected?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of co-occurring mental health conditions. So anxiety and depression are incredibly common in autistic people, as are eating disorders, PTSD, OCD, and some personality disorders. And, a lot of these do develop because of a mismatch between, the way that an autistic person's brain works and the way that their environment is. A common analogy that I like to use is it's kind of like being left-handed. There's nothing wrong with being left-handed, but it's challenging because the world is made for right-handed people. And I think, with neurodiversity, it's very similar that, you walk into any office building or any school and the lights are bright and fluorescent, and places are loud and very sort of sensory stimulating. And so navigating this when your brain is very sensitive to this, or having parents who don't recognize this and who think, oh, you're just being stubborn, and so you have to sit at the table until you finish this food, or, you got to go with what I say rather than I'm going to be responsive to what you need, that has an impact on people. And so, a lot of people, it's very interesting. There's been some research about anxiety and depression in autistic adults, and there does seem to be sort of an increase in anxiety and depression sort of in the 20s and 30s, and then it goes down again. And I think a lot of that is people have a lot more control over their environment, and people are deciding, being able to choose what they want, and probably masking to a lower degree. And so just being able to be more comfortable, sort of not forcing themselves into these situations that are gonna increase that anxiety and depression and burnout.
So you talked about this a little bit, but are there like specific mental health diagnoses that people with autism generally experience?
So they definitely co-occur. So I think eating disorders and PTSD are other really big ones. And again, different people can experience the same trauma and have very different reactions to that. Similarly, I think eating disorders, if you are sensitive to the textures of food, well, you might start eating a smaller, variety of foods. And if you have a tendency to be very routine oriented, then you might, sort of let that influence what food looks like. And so, I think those, I wouldn't say those are caused by autism, but I think they're more common just because the two of those sort of, sometimes reinforce each other, which can be tough. I think too, this idea of overwhelm and having reactions to, just being overwhelmed, whether it's sensory overwhelm, whether it is, oh my gosh, I was thinking things were going to go this way, and then suddenly there's this change that I wasn't expecting. People often have meltdowns or shutdowns. And so this is, a kind of a big emotional reaction, and sort of becoming dysregulated. And so this is sometimes misunderstood. Sometimes this is seen as a tantrum, sometimes seen as being over dramatic, a panic attack. Again, from the outside, it can be a little hard I think they're probably easy to identify. Something is going on, but it's hard to sort of understand why that's happening. But that is incredibly common with autism. And then another one that I sort of touched on earlier, burnout is a really big thing. And this is definitely, everybody experiences, or everybody could experience, job burnout or things. But autistic burnout is a little bit different, where it is, again, just too much exposure to a life that doesn't quite fit your needs. And so, it's definitely related to masking. It's related to, all this extra work and all this extra effort that autistic people often have to give, just going through normal life. And it can look a lot like depression, but it doesn't really get better with depression treatment. And so this is another one that's really important for people to understand and to identify, so they can start getting better and getting out of burnout.
So going along with that, people with autism are looking for support around these things. Is it kind of the same support that people not on the spectrum are getting, or is there kind of more nuanced care that they have to look for?
Yeah, so, I think it is always important for autistic people to work with practitioners who understand neurodiversity and understand masking and how that impacts mental health. So, I always recommend to clients that, find someone who is neurodiversity affirming, who sort of knows their stuff, has a modern, updated information about what this looks like in individuals. And if you can't find that, then find somebody that you can relate to, and someone who's willing to learn, and you can learn together, because I think there's probably not enough. But an example, so cognitive behavioral therapy is a super common therapy, that many, many therapists use. It's not actually the best fit for autistic adults. I think it focuses on the thoughts and sort of tying thoughts and behaviors and emotions all together. And lots of times that is not the biggest issue. That lots of times it is, the sensory overwhelm, or it is, dealing with transitions or routines. And so, I think there are types of therapy that can be more beneficial, and an experienced practitioner who understands that, maybe can still use some aspects of CBT, but taking into account, these other aspects of autism, I think are incredibly important. I mean, same kind of thing with eating disorder treatment. There's a huge overlap between, eating disorders and autism, and a treatment that is focusing just on eating and not taking into account kind of why this was an issue in the first place. It's not going to be very effective.
Yeah, so I think making sure to have a person who's well-rounded in, or just knowledgeable about neurodiversity is key. But for people who think they may have autism or have gotten a diagnosis and don't know where to start, what is a good place for people to start, receiving the supports that they need?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So it's exciting. It's an exciting time to be curious about autism. I think that there's way more out there than there ever was before. There are some really excellent books that are written by autistic authors that I often recommend to people. So two of the best that I think are Unmasking Autism by Devon Price, and Divergent Mind by Jenara Nerenberg. And those are just two of a few. There are lots of books written by autistic authors, and so I think that those are great. And not just books. I mean, there's blogs and websites and social media, where people are sharing their experiences, and I think that that's awesome. And I encourage people to, that you don't have to invent everything yourself. If you can learn from wisdom that other people have gained, that's awesome. If people are not sure and are kind of trying to figure this out, there are some free online assessments that people can take to get a sense of is this likely to be a thing? Is this a possibility? And yeah, I think if this resonates, then, trying to find a doctor who does this kind of work. And again, this if we're talking about adults, it's challenging to find the right doctor, but I think it's also really important. And, you know, in the autistic community, again, this, you know, there has been a very growing community of autistic individuals. You know, self-diagnosis is accepted because it is so hard to get a formal diagnosis, you know, both with cost and accessibility and, you know, so yeah, people don't have to have that diagnosis before they get started, you know, making some of these changes in their lives. Like I said, I am starting up an online support community for autistic individuals, and it's called Autistic Support Network, AutisticSupportNetwork.com. And my goal is just to provide this space that people can talk to each other and ask questions. And, you know, hopefully this will lead to some other cool stuff. It is still, you know, in its very early phases, but you know, I think there's such a need, and so many people that I talk to feel really isolated, and I think that's really hard. And so, you know, just having a friend, having somebody that you can connect with, I mean, can be life-changing. So I encourage people to do that.
Yeah, I love that. I love hearing all of the things that you're putting in place for people. And I want to ask about your practice specifically. Like, can you tell us a little bit about your practice and the ways that you support people with this diagnosis?
Yeah. So I, you know, sort of in my professional work, I mostly do evaluations. So I don't do like ongoing therapy just because there's only one of me and I don't have a ton of time. So which is why I'm setting up some of these other things, you know, that hopefully have a bigger reach and a bigger impact. But yeah, you know, my background was in working with younger kids, and there's a very big difference between, you know, evaluating a child and evaluating an adult. And so I've tried to be very intentional with how I sort of do the whole process with adults. I try to be very, very transparent, very upfront, have people, you know, people have the opportunity to provide a ton of information in writing, because I know that, you know, lots of times, yeah, on the spot in a, you know, just in a live or video chat, I mean, it can be very overwhelming for people. And so, yeah, just providing lots of information, you know, I sort of outline a lot of the questions I'm going to ask. And so people can sort of think through that on the front end. You know, I even tell them, you know, if you think of things later, you can send me stuff later. The door doesn't close at the end of our appointment. And really just sort of meeting people where they are. Because again, this is information for somebody's mental health so they can move forward and sort of live their best life. And so, you know, if it doesn't have to be this, I don't know, this very black and white sort of medical process, you know, and can be a little more friendly and a little more, I don't know, just easy on both sides. I don't see a downside to that.
Yeah, I love that, because I think it can be scary to go in and get a diagnosis. So the fact that you're creating this welcoming, warm, and relaxing environment for people to come and get this work is really amazing. So I'm so excited to hear about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm constantly kind of changing, you know, and even based on feedback I get from clients, if someone's like, oh man, this was really hard, like I should warn people on the front end that this thing is hard. And, you know, I am still learning, and I am still sort of revising and trying to make it as good a process as it can be. And I don't know, it's a work in progress, but I think it's at a pretty good place.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I have 2 more questions. This next question is something that I've been asking all of my guests this season. I want to put an emphasis on self-care this season because of how important it is. So my question for you is, what is one thing you do each day to maintain mental wellness?
Yes, so that's a great question. I think I knew you were going to ask this, and I really had to think, because there's a couple of things. But I think probably exercising. I feel good, and I start my day every day by, you know, either hopping on the spin bike or yoga or weights or whatever. And I have learned that if I don't do that at the beginning of the day, then I will probably run out of time with all the other stuff that life throws at me. And also I've learned that I feel good when I do it. It just sort of sets me off on a productive, sort of positive path. So, yeah, I do that. And I recently got a dog, so there's going to be a lot of outdoor walks in my future when the weather gets a little bit nicer here in Chicago as well.
Oh, that'll be great. A new pup. That's amazing. So, lastly, if myself and my audience would like to get in contact with you or stay up to date with the work that you're doing, how can we do that?
Yeah, so like I said, probably TikTok is a great place to start. I am Dr. Jessica Mizak on TikTok. And then if you are interested in my practice, it is, the website is helpandhealingcenter.com. And if you are interested in connecting over this support network, it is autistic-supportnetwork.com. And I am very optimistic about it. It's my newest project, but I think it's going to be really cool. So I hope that people reach out and enjoy.
Great. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. I learned so much. I think people listening will learn a lot, and it'll just be nice to have, I don't know, I've heard autism and mental health talked about in separate conversations, but a few in the same conversation. But I think it's nice to have a conversation where we kind of bridge the gap between the two. So thank you so much for being here and providing all this information.
No problem. I appreciate being on here. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing and sharing information. So I love it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Students of Mind. This has been a topic that I've been curious about for some time, so it was great to sit down with Dr. Myszak and talk about this. If you're interested in seeing more of her work, all of her links will be listed in the description of this episode. As always, social links for the Students of Mind team are listed in the description as well. Don't forget to check out the episode webpage, also listed in the description, for the full show notes and any episode resources that were mentioned. If you have a moment, please leave a rating and review for the show. This helps me tremendously by getting the show into more ears and letting new listeners know what they can expect from the show. Thank you so much again for listening. I hope you learned something new or resonated with something you heard today, and I will see you next episode.